On April 12, 1955, Dr. Thomas Francis Jr. stood in front of the crowded Rackham Lecture Hall at the University of Michigan to announce the results of the much-anticipated Salk vaccine field trial. The massive vaccine trial had been in the works for several years, and the releasing of the results had become a much-anticipated event. Beyond the publicity, however, the trials were meticulously run and represented a major milestone in experimental medicine. The 1954 Salk vaccine field trial was a revolution in vaccine testing procedure. In 1894, the first major polio epidemic in the United States struck Vermont. 132 citizens became infected with the virus. In the years following, more and more polio cases began to appear. In 1916, New York experienced a major epidemic of over 9,000 cases. The turn of the century marked the rise of a new disease that was scarcely understood and seemingly uncontrollable. In 1921, as polio numbers soared, a young politician named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, contracted the disease and was left with severe paralysis. Despite his disability, FDR continued his political career and won the presidential nomination in 1932. In 1937, with the help of his former law partner Basil O'Connor, FDR would announce the creation of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, NFIP, better known as the March of Dimes. The NFIP would later play a large role in the approval and of the funding for the Salk vaccine field trial. As researchers learned more and more about the polio virus, pressure for a vaccine skyrocketed. In 1935, physicians Maurice Brodie and John Colmer decided to try their hands at making the sought-after preventative. At the time, however, no one had been able to grow polio virus in a laboratory. Brodie didn't let this discourage him, and instead used the spinal cord of infected monkeys to develop his vaccine, developing his vaccine before Colmer. After minimal laboratory testing, Brodie decided the vaccine was ready for human testing. The vaccine was proven less than effective. In fact, the vaccine caused multiple cases of polio, some of which were fatal. The scheduled field trial of the Colmer vaccine was subsequently canceled. The Brodie-Colmer field trial fiasco would not soon be forgotten by polio researchers and would lead to increased vigilance and safety procedures regarding future vaccine trials. The onset of the 1940s marked another spike in polio cases. Between 1945 and 1949, the U.S. averaged 20,000 polio cases annually. The rise in the epidemic numbers and the pressure from the NFIP brought polio to the forefront of many researchers' priorities. Among these researchers was Jonas Salk. Salk had worked with his mentor, Dr. Thomas Francis Jr., on the development of the influenza vaccine during World War II and had developed a deep interest in killed virus vaccines. In 1947, he accepted a research position at the University of Pittsburgh and began work involving the polio virus in 1948. Coincidentally the same year that polio virus was successfully cultivated in a laboratory. The young doctor was put to work sorting different strains of the virus into larger categories. Salk quickly completed the virus typing project and used his NFIP funding to explore the possibility of creating a killed polio virus vaccine. The majority of the polio researchers at the time felt that a live weakened virus vaccine would be more effective in preventing the virus, but Dr. Salk felt that after his experience in developing the influenza vaccine, that the safety benefits of a killed virus vaccine would outweigh the slight decline in effectiveness. Using the methods developed by Dr. John Enders, Dr. Salk and his lab staff began the rigorous process of cultivating the virus in the kidney tissue of rhesus monkeys. The vaccine was then killed using a formaldehyde mixture to deactivate the virus. After intensive and rigorous testing of many batches of differently prepared vaccines, Dr. Salk was able to create a batch that he considered to be both safe and effective. The Salk vaccine had been created. Before the NFIP would even consider testing the vaccine on human subjects, Dr. Salk would have to prove its safety. The Brodie-Colmer vaccine testing disaster still haunted many of the senior members of the foundation. If Dr. Salk wanted his vaccine to be tested on children, he would first have to prove its safety to the NFIP. The vaccine's safety and efficiency was first rigorously tested on monkeys. Batches and batches of the vaccine were injected into the continuously observed monkeys. When the vaccine proved safe in the monkey tests, Dr. Salk moved on to testing his vaccine on children who had already been crippled by polio. Testing his vaccine on the children of the D.T. Watson Home for Crippled Children, Salk was able to test his vaccine in children who would have a lower risk of catching the disease, as they had already been exposed to one of the 3 possible strains. When the vaccine failed to infect any of the Watson home children, Dr. Salk moved on to the next stage of testing his vaccine. The next step would be to test the vaccine on children who had never contracted the disease, but the possibility of a massive field trial was still years away. Salk's next move was to test the vaccine at the Polk State School, a home for mentally ill children. It was believed at the time that testing on children whose future potential was already limited was a necessary precursor to testing on healthy children. The Polk School tests ran smoothly. It was time to test the vaccine on healthy American children. With polio at the forefront of many Americans' minds, the field trial was sure to become a majorly publicized event. The NFIP wanted to make sure the trials were credible and fairly evaluated. In order to ensure the trial's impartiality, the foundation hired Dr. Thomas Francis Jr. of influenza vaccine fame to run the trial. This revolutionary move would ensure the trial was separated from the politics of the foundation. Dr. Francis took on the challenge and set up a vaccine evaluation lab at the University of Michigan.
I'm doing this, and I already kind of suspect, I believe it might work, and the person that I'm doing it with might also believe it might work, then we're kind of come to the study with a bias. We want to believe that it's going to work, and the problem is that bias can actually make it look like it works to us, but in reality it doesn't. So in order to know really whether it works or not, then it's important for me for us to control the study.
Dr. Francis's first major contribution to the trials was to modify the layout. Instead of the vaccine trial being simply observational, Francis insisted that the trial be composed of two smaller studies, one of which would be observational and the other a double-blind study. 33 states participated in the observational study in which first and third graders were observed in order for the year's polio trends to be recorded. Second graders in these states would be given the vaccine. 11 other states participated in the double-blind study. A portion of the participating children received the vaccine, while the remaining participants received a placebo. The only people who knew which children had received the vaccine were Dr. Francis and his team at the Vaccine Evaluation Lab. Participating children were each given a lollipop and a badge or card declaring them a polio pioneer. Parents were encouraged not to think of the trial as an experiment, but rather as an opportunity.
I believe that something might work, then I might want to see that answer in my results. Regulation is set up in a way so that way the interpretation of what we find is very clear.
The sheer size of the trial was unprecedented, and support from local officials was crucial. Still the largest vaccine trial on record, the trial involved over 1.8 million children. 20,000 physicians, 40,000 nurses, 14,000 elementary school principals, 50,000 teachers, and over 200,000 volunteers helped make the trial possible. Over 237 gallons of the vaccine were used. Records of the participants were stored on 1.8 million IBM punch cards containing over 144 million pieces of information. Dr. Francis carried out the trials in a truly methodical manner. In the rare event of the death of a participant, Dr. Francis would personally evaluate the cause in order to ensure the safety of the vaccine. The trial, which was referred to by some as the greatest gamble in medical history, was ultimately a success. On April 12, 1955, the 10th anniversary of FDR's death, Dr. Francis announced the results during a press conference at the University of Michigan. The vaccine was both safe and effective. It had shown 68% effectiveness against type 1 polio, 100% against type 2, and 92% against type 3. There had been no fatalities among the 444,000 children given the vaccine. In the weeks following, the vaccine would be licensed for public use and distributed to the public. Although the methodical nature of the Salk vaccine field trial would not be continued in the majority of medical trials during the 1950s and 60s, it would leave behind a legacy of how a major trial could be properly run. The trials, considered by many to be the largest public health experiment ever, were well before their time and continued to be an example of a well-run medical experiment.